We're moving on to video 2 of the legislative branch. You should have your guided notes out on your desk. We're going to talk today about impeachment, privileges of Congress, and the different powers that Congress has. We're going to begin with impeachment. A lot of people think that to impeach someone is to kick them out of office, but that is not correct. It actually means to formally accuse someone of a wrongdoing or misuse of power. And anybody in office can be impeached. So the president, vice president, any congressional members, judges. It is a difficult process, but it does happen. And this is how it works. So first, the House of Representatives has total power to start the process, to begin the impeachment proceedings. They start the process off, and they have the power to impeach with a majority vote. They act like a grand jury. So I want you to imagine our grand jury versus our trial jury. So the House of Representatives would look at the evidence to decide if they should have a trial. And again, they're looking at that valid evidence to decide if they've possibly committed a wrongdoing. Then they have to decide with a majority vote whether or not to move on to have an actual trial. And then, so if you can imagine that the House of Representatives is the grand jury, then who would be the trial jury? Yes, it would be the Senate. The Senate conducts the trial and acts as the trial jury, deciding if the person is guilty or innocent. So they'll listen to the testimony just as the trial jury. They have full due process laws. So again, presenting evidence and witnesses, having a lawyer. And the vice president would serve as the judge for the trial. There could potentially be a conflict of interest there. So if the president or vice president is on trial, then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the one that would preside as the judge over the trial. And this really just prevents there from being a conflict of interest. And when I say conflict of interest, I'm talking about the close relationship that a vice president and a president have might interfere with the judgment of the case. And so they want to make sure that they have an unbiased presence over the trial. And so that's why they would have the Supreme Court justice do it over the president or vice president. Our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Roberts. We're going to be learning more about the Supreme Court coming up soon when we talk about the judicial branch. He's up there to the right. Continuing on with the impeachment process, a 2/3 vote must be made by the Senate to expel a member from either house. So to decide if the person is guilty, 2/3 vote from the Senate, so that would mean 67 senators would need to find the person guilty for them to leave office. There could potentially be some sort of punishment depending on the case, but for sure to leave office, judge, congressional member, president, whoever it may be, must get a 2/3 vote from the Senate. So 67 senators. We've had 2 presidents who've been impeached, and those 2 are Andrew Johnson and William Clinton. Most people know him as Bill, but formal name is William. Both of them were found not guilty by the Senate. So for Andrew Johnson, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Johnson because he refused to cooperate or compromise over black rights and the reconstruction of southern state governments. And this was right after the Civil War. But under the Constitution, Congress had to charge him with high crimes or misdemeanors. So the president himself never appeared in the Senate during the trial. The Senate failed by 1 vote to convict Johnson and remove him from the presidency. He had only 9 months left of his term, so his hopes for getting reelected again were pretty much gone. So that's Andrew Johnson. This was 1868. You guys don't need to know the details, but a lot of people ask, so I like to put it in my video. For Bill Clinton, this was in 1999. The House of Representatives voted to impeach President Clinton because of character issues brought into question while being president. After much denial, Clinton admitted that he had an affair with an intern during his presidency. The House formally impeached him with perjury, which you guys know is lying under oath, and obstruction of justice for lying about the incident. And in 1999, they acquitted the president on both counts, which means they found him not guilty. Many people believe that Richard Nixon was impeached, but that's not true. This was in 1972 to 1974, after 5 men hired by Nixon's re-election committee were caught burglarizing Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate complex in 1972. His behavior, President Nixon's behavior, his cover-up of the burglary, and the refusal to turn over evidence led the House committee to issue 3 articles of impeachment, but he resigned from office before they could impeach him. And so he was never formally impeached. He resigned. So there's a little background on the impeachment process. Again, just 2 presidents that were impeached, both found not guilty. I'm actually, in the beginning of this video, I said that we're going to talk about the privileges of Congress. I'm actually going to skip that in your notes. So disregard that beginning title, I apologize. We're going to move on to enumerated powers of Congress. You guys have seen that word, you've heard that word. We talked about it last week with the principles of the Constitution. And enumerated powers are those powers that are specifically listed in the Constitution and the things that Congress can do. So we'll just fill in the blanks as we go. First, regulate foreign and domestic trade. States are not able to make treaties with other countries. They regulate those trades that are made between within the states and also between other countries. Establish rules of naturalization and bankruptcy. So bankruptcy would be when a person can't pay debt, so the bank will take their property and divide it up among the creditors. And it also has to do with companies too. Naturalization would be if somebody is not a citizen of the United States, it's the process to become a citizen. So they pick the rules for that. Coin money, one type of currency. So remember we talked about how the states used to have their own money and it got really crazy and people didn't know how to pay each other and it just didn't work out. So states can't coin their own money. There's only one type of currency. Punish counterfeiters. So that's the people who make fake money can't do it. That's why when you go to the store, sometimes they'll look at if it's a larger bill, they'll look at it in the light, or they might use a special pen on it. So they want to make sure that people aren't using counterfeit money. And you may have come across a counterfeited bill, but they're really investigating the people that they know are making lots of currency, not just dollar bills. They're going to be making those high bills, and they're going to catch those counterfeiters. Continuing on with enumerated powers, Congress can establish U.S. post offices and highways. They can pass patent and copyright laws. So examples would be like invention. So you have to get a patent. If you have an idea, you want to patent it so other people can't take your idea. So they pass the laws for that. Same with copyright laws, specific to music. I would say on my notes I had CDs. We're kind of beyond that. So now it's probably with like different copyright laws with if you create a song and then someone were to maybe steal that song and say that they wrote it, then that obviously would be illegal. Declare war. We talked about this. So one person can't have power to declare war. And who is this a check on? I want you to think about when Congress declares war, who are they checking? Whose power are they checking in that moment? I want you to think about that. Raise and support the U.S. military, so they raise money from taxes to support our military. And finally, they can call up the National Guard. So the National Guard, as a reminder, are citizens who help with natural disasters. Moving on to other powers. Think back to the principles of the Constitution. We've talked about enumerated powers. Those are powers listed in the Constitution specific for the federal government. And now we're moving on to concurrent. Concurrent powers are those that are shared by the states and the federal government. And there's many, but I'm going to list 2. One is they collect taxes. They both do that. And 2, establish the 2 courts beneath the Supreme Court. So the 2 courts beneath the Supreme Court are the district courts and the Court of Appeals. District is your lowest level. Court of Appeals is where you appeal your case. And then it could potentially go to the Supreme Court. There is both federal Supreme Court and there's state level. And we'll talk more about the difference between like the Illinois state constitution and the U.S. Constitution because every state has its own. But these powers are shared. And then we have reserved powers, powers kept for the states and the people, or reserved. I want you to think back to your amendments. Which one has to do with reserved? Last seat, reserved is, and your examples would be education, driving regulations, lottery. Which amendment? The 10th. Federalism, as a reminder, I'm not going to have you guys put this in your notes, but federalism is the division of power between the federal government and the states. You guys already saw this Venn diagram. It's in your previous notes. You can always refer back, but it's just showing those powers and how each has, let's see, federal government has its own powers, states have its own powers, and then there's those shared powers that they both have. Moving on to implied powers, you could also call these unenumerated powers because these are not listed in the Constitution, but they're powers that are suggested powers, should say needed, I apologize for that, needed to help carry out specifically listed powers in the Constitution. So they're not written, but they support those that are listed. So Congress can make any laws which are necessary and proper. This is called the elastic clause. So they can pass any law to uphold or enforce their power. So once again, these are not listed in the Constitution. They knew that things would change. The framers of the Constitution knew that things would change throughout the years, and so they knew they couldn't list everything in the Constitution. Congress has the power to regulate different industries. So air travel is one of them. Think of the TSA. You go through the lines, check security, making sure planes are safe. They regulate that. Second one is industries, different industries like the FCC. You know, when you listen to the radio, if you guys ever listen to the radio, maybe when you're in the car with your parents, maybe not, but you know, you can't swear. It beeps it out. So they regulate those industries. Those radio stations get fined if that happens. And they also control like movies and ratings, whatever they're rated. That's also a part of that. And then finally, food and medication is another one. So making sure that there's labels on different products, that they're up to date, that medical devices, the FDA is another one, Food and Drug Administration, making sure they're following the guidelines of the FDA. So they regulate those different industries. Like I said, those weren't around when the framers created the Constitution. So it was something that it's not listed, but they are regulated. This is the 9th Amendment. We're moving on to things that Congress is not allowed to do. Okay, they're prohibited, cannot do it. First is, and you've heard this word before, habeas corpus. Okay, so habeas corpus, produce the body in Latin. It really means that a prisoner must be presented before a judge to be charged with a specific crime, or else the prisoner must be released. You cannot hold people indefinitely. You have to charge them within a reasonable amount of time. Otherwise, you have to release them. And that means if you don't have the evidence you need to charge them with a crime, you got to let them go. So that's called habeas corpus. And this can only be suspended, meaning you could hold on to a prisoner without producing them for a judge if the nation's in rebellion or they're being invaded by a foreign nation. And this is, for example, if they think that there's somebody that's a spy or a terrorist to the country, then they don't have to produce the body. We're talking serious crime here. We're not talking, you know, he went and tried to, you know, rob the jewel. That would not be enough. So we're talking in terrorism. They don't have to produce the body if we are in rebellion. The other thing that Congress can't do is they can't pass a bill of attainder. This means they can't convict a person without a trial. Everybody gets due process. You cannot bypass that process. Everybody gets a trial by jury. Everybody gets a right to appeal your case. Have a lawyer, show evidence, and have witnesses defend you. You can't just convict somebody. You have to go through that process. So you can't pass a bill of attainder, which means that you convict them without a trial. That's what that means. Continuing on with things that Congress cannot do. They cannot pass ex post facto laws. This means that you punish somebody for a crime that wasn't a crime when it was committed. An ex post facto would be after the fact laws. You cannot punish someone and then make the law. There has to be a law in place first. And I have a Starbucks there because I have an example about Starbucks after I get through this slide. I'll show you. The next one is Congress cannot take money from the U.S. Treasury unless authorized. So every single penny is counted for. You can't just go in and take the money. Not allowed. Finally, no title shall be granted by the U.S. So it's not going to be King Trump. I mean, maybe he'd like to do that, but he can't do it according to the Constitution. Not written. Still can't do it. No king, queen, princess, etc. And thinking back to England, there was a reason why they, added that in there. So again, things they cannot do. I'm going to give you an ex post facto example. I don't know if you'll need an example, but I like to have one just in case. I'm using myself in this example. Mrs. Edison had been working in the yard on a hot Monday in July. She decided to go to Starbucks to get a refreshing caramel macchiato, her favorite, which is really my favorite. Mrs. Edison parked on State Street, went in to get her drink, and came back out to find a parking lot. So I'm talking about the Starbucks that's on the corner of 3rd Street and 38. Mrs. Edison was angry because there weren't any signs indicating that she wasn't allowed to park in that spot. So that was on Monday. We're on Friday now. On Friday, Mrs. Edison went down to the police station to pay her ticket. When she arrived, she found out that the no parking law on State Street had been passed on Tuesday. And Mrs. Edison had been punished for parking in the spot on Monday. This is obviously not fair and is considered an ex post facto law after the fact. Now, this is a local example. And Congress can't pass these. And really, at a local level, they can't do that either. So this is a smaller scale of an example, but I wanted to clarify. Can't pass a law after somebody's been punished. Not fair. And that's it. Video number 2, done. Done with notes. Work on your vocab, prep for the quiz.